When I think of Paul Gallagher, I think of Charles Atlas. And I think of Charles Atlas holding up the world, because Paul was the single axis on which the entire university rested. Paul was extremely dedicated. Another way in which his dedication showed through is that when there was a hole in the team, whether it was first base, second base, shortstop, we had 7 different vice presidencies. And at one time, Paul held every one of them. And I believe, having talked to a lot of other presidents, that that is a national record. No one has what Paul had, which is the versatility, the flexibility, the adaptability to one day be a finance wizard, the next day be the spirit moving our North Campus, now called our Biscayne Bay campus.
This always was such a welcoming place, and it was made that way because of people like Paul. Back then, we were new. We didn't know what we couldn't do, and because of that, we felt limitless, and that anything that we wanted to do was just here for the taking. And that's what made working for people like Paul that had that, just that wonderful nature and that larger than life personality and passion about everything he did. It just resonated down to all of us.
I can't think of anything that happened at FIU that Paul didn't have a hand in. And I'm not saying that he was necessarily the impetus for each of those things, but certainly he had a hand in when we got in School of Architecture, a law school, even way back on the medical school. I mean, there is a major program, a major facility that he wasn't involved in. He came with his guns loaded, but he was never confrontational about it. He got his point across. He made sure you got it, but it was kind of fun.
When I met Paul, because he was so intelligent and had a handle on almost everything, I was a bit intimidated, to be very honest with you, and I so much wanted to impress the university community because I did not come from academia. And as I got to know Paul, I became more and more comfortable. But what really clinched it for me with Paul was when I had a death in my family, the first of one of my siblings to pass away. And Dr. Medique, Paul Gallagher, Mary Pankowski, and others came to my little hometown of Palatka, Florida on a private jet. They flew in, all coordinated by Paul Gallagher. It was his big heart, and I can say that Dr. Medique would agree, that made that happen. But what really, really clinched it for me with Paul was when my mom passed away, again in Palatka, Florida, little town. And I got out of the hearse and walked into the church and looked into Paul's eyes. He was standing there at the door. And so for me, that said to me what a huge heart and what a great friend he was. And I really and truly love Paul Gallagher, a great man, a great attribute to this university, a great attribute to any friend that calls him a friend.
Well, the moment I learned about Paul's passing, I went in shock. I really couldn't believe it. I had just seen him. Paul gone? I was so distraught. I ended up calling some friends. Hey, Paul, and we talked about it and that helped. But you know what really helped me was I got in my car and I went through campus from west to east. And as I passed the stadium and passed the housing complex and passed the arena, the Children's Learning Center, College of Education, and of course the Graham Center, you know, I could see Paul there. Paul was everywhere. You know, he built this university. Paul, indeed, he was a trailblazer. And he had a vision for the university, and he went and did it.
Paul was very elegant. Paul had a lot of personal power. He knew it. He controlled it very well. He could take a project that was very complex and actually implement it very effortlessly, which is why I think Dr. Medique at the time called on Paul quite a bit to tackle those difficult things, law school, medical school, sponsored research assignments, fundraising assignments. Paul was in the midst of it all. Sometimes you didn't even know he was in the midst, but he was. He made things happen, and that's why he was relied upon by everybody.
When I first became president, I was disappointed to see how desolate this campus was. It had a few buildings, nothing else. And I said to Paul, you know, a campus needs green spaces, needs trees, needs places of shade. And I said, I'd like to plant some trees. And Paul said, sure, I can get a few trees planted. Where do you want them? I said, no, you don't understand, Paul. I want hundreds. I want thousands of trees. And Paul said, let me see what I can do. Let me see how I can figure this out. So he presented me with a plan within the following year or so to plant 500 trees. So as you drive down 8th Street and you see all those trees, those are Gallagher trees, every one of them.
As a founding faculty member here, I had an opportunity to work with Paul in so many different ways. Perhaps one of the most significant ones is that Paul was truly the out front person in relation to FIU moving to football. And at the time, there was a lot of controversy. There wasn't total unanimity among faculty and administrators as that we should do this. But Paul was truly a champion of developing the facility, ensuring that we met all of the compliances in relation to NCAA, starting the facility, dealing with that area, and really championed that piece and continued even after we had gotten that to be concerned about the success of student athletes. So I see that as one area that was very important to him, and I think a major reflection of both his determination, his vision, and his ability to be able to implement and take something from nothing to its existence.
FIU football is just fantabulous. This is for the students. They've been waiting it for longer than I have. This is just great. And we have the provost support.
That's right. I'm delighted about football as long as all my students go to class and then come to the football game. We're delighted.
And we're pleased that Dr. Rosenberg brought us this weather and a sellout crowd. This is the first sellout crowd of an athletic event at FIU in 30 years.
Paul could engage anyone. He had no enemies that I'm certainly aware of. He had that infectious good humor, that positivism that made him stand out. There wasn't anything he thought, once he put his mind to it, and once he believed that it should be done, that he couldn't do. And I think that rubbed off. What I remember most about Paul Gallagher was that he was a man who had a solution for every problem. There was no good idea that he wouldn't respond to by saying, that's great, we can find a way to do that. I remember I was complaining to him about needing some money in creative writing. He said, let me think about that. And the next day I had a phone call and he said, you know what? You and I are going to tag team Barnes & Noble and we're going to get a big potload of money. And I said, well, if you say so, Paul. Well, before it was all over, he had worked them down here. I flew up to New York City, went to the corporate offices, spoke to Mr. Riggio himself, and at the end of that process, guess what? We had a $350,000 grant, which was, with the match, if we ever get it, would be worth $500,000. And that's Paul Gallagher for you. He was a great guy, and he was enthusiastic and full of positive energy, and I miss him.
Paul served as Vice President of Student Affairs for a period of time. And when I assumed that role, Paul said to me, Rosa, it's one of the areas that I grew a lot in because I had an opportunity to interface with students in an administrative role that I really, really enjoyed. And I really think that a large number of people don't realize how important the interaction with students was to him. Paul was a champion of focusing on students in relation to access. And people may not realize that, but one of the things that I had an opportunity to work with him on was our PIP Partners in Progress program and our ability to be able to implement institutional dollars for students once they were here.
Paul Gallagher. I don't even remember the first time meeting Paul. It just seems like Paul was always here and always everywhere at FIU, wherever you kind of turned. When I first heard about Paul's passing, the immediate thought that came to my mind was when my daughter Michelle was very young, probably 2 or 3, and I don't know what happened to the nanny that day, but something happened and I ended up having to take her to Modesto Modique campus, and it was a meeting that Paul was chairing. And I was petrified, not that Michelle would misbehave, but that, you know, what was everybody going to think and what was Paul going to think in particular. And so when he came in the room, I went up to him and I started apologizing for the fact that Michelle had to be there, and Paul stopped me and he said, "Don't ever apologize for bringing your daughter onto this campus and to work with you." He said, "My daughter Jenny has always come with me to work, and I want to make sure that you always feel that Michelle is welcome here." And she always was, and she's now 20 and literally grew up here, and a lot of that is because of Paul.
One story of Paul and I out in front of the, I guess it was the administration building near the fountain. Somehow somebody had unloaded what they called a sculpture. It looked like a bunch of scrap steel that somebody had put together and left there. It was rusty, old, and I walked around it, looked at it, and I was just shaking my head. Why would anybody put this stuff here? And the next thing I felt was a hand on my shoulder, and I looked up, and it was Paul. And I says, "Paul, for God's sake, where did this come from?" He says, "Ed, it's a sculpture." He said, "Don't you see it?" I said, "No." He says, "Walk around it." And I walked around it, and I said, "Paul, it still looks like a load of scrap iron." And we both laughed, and that's the way Paul was. He didn't try to influence you. He just said, take it for what it is. And that's how I always remember Paul. He had a smile on his face constantly. I always had a hand on my shoulder, a hand around my back. Paul was always close to everyone. And so, yes, I will miss that man. And I have tears in my eyes now just thinking about it.
Paul was an extraordinary colleague whose energy and creativity, and especially his good humor, made life as a university administrator much more agreeable than it might have been. These talents gave him the ability to be part of almost every major aspect of growth and development of the university for many years, and I want to thank him for it now, even if I may have disagreed with his priorities occasionally then. He was a great colleague and one that I valued very much.
I have fond memories of Paul, including his remarkable contributions to the growth and quality of FIU. I can tell you firsthand that his enthusiasm, intellect, judgment, and tenacity made a lasting and distinctive contribution to the fine university that we all enjoy today. Paul lives in my memories, and I'm personally thankful for his terrific attitude, hard work, and his friendship.
You know, we have this slogan here that we are FIU. I don't think that anybody exemplifies that they are FIU and that they have invested in FIU as much as Paul has. And I think his imprint is all over this university in relation to both buildings, facilities, program development. He's been in so many capacities that I think that he is truly FIU.
I don't know what to tell you other than we're going to miss you, Paul. We're going to miss you a lot. I'm going to miss not being corrected as you did, you know, so often. And I'm going to miss not having you around, because one of the things about Paul, and this is maybe, you know, you can say that someone is an intelligent man, someone is charming, someone is talented, knowledgeable, and he was those things. But more than anything, Paul Gallagher was a good man, a very good man.